Joining me today is a historian of the modern Middle East at Sarah Lawrence College, whose work examines political movements, state formation, and the narratives that shape regional conflict. Professor Matthew Ellis, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So, to start, I want to begin at the conceptual level before we move into specific regional examples. So, how do you define propaganda in the context of modern political conflict?
It's a great question, and I have an answer that might be a little counterintuitive or different from what some other scholars you talk to might have to say. Because for me, propaganda isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's often associated with really negative political projects, but to me, propaganda is best understood in a more expansive way, adopting a pretty wide definition. I know that doesn't work for everyone. So I would say propaganda is any attempt to make a claim using various tools of persuasion that attempt to galvanize people into action or inaction, as the case may be, or to persuade people of a particular point of view, right? So it's a pretty broad view, but I think that propaganda usually is some kind of attempt to communicate on the mass scale. I didn't say that before, that is attempting to persuade or to galvanize action or inaction. And it usually does that through representation of reality in a certain way, putting forward a certain kind of image of society or the social order that it wants to put forward.
Yeah. So, a lot of professors I've spoken to seem to have these two different ideas of persuasion and propaganda, but you sort of meld them together a little more. So, would you mind explaining why that line is kind of blurred for you?
Yeah, I think that you know, it's useful to think of propaganda as mass persuasion, right? So if I'm just trying to persuade you of a certain viewpoint, or even if like that the Yankees are better than the Mets or something, that's obviously not propaganda, right? So individual persuasion, where you're just trying to get someone to adopt a viewpoint, I wouldn't call that propaganda. However, the situation changes when you're trying to persuade at a mass scale, right? So if you're putting out some kind of communication, whether that's a social media post or a radio broadcast or a TV program, right? Or you write a manifesto and it's kind of scattershot intended for a mass audience, I think that's easily understood as propaganda. So yeah, I think the scale has everything to do with it. Not all persuasion is propaganda, but all propaganda is, I think, is an attempt at persuasion in some sense.
Okay, and so moving on a little bit to your background with the Middle East, during periods of violence or instability, early claims often shape the public perception before the facts are fully verified. So, how does misinformation and this propaganda sort of shape our public understanding during conflicts in the Middle East?
Well, I think propaganda has a major role in shaping how we understand everything that's happening in our world. And I think sometimes it can be the shaping of reality so that, it's not necessarily misinformation. Sometimes it's just what you're allowed to see and not see. So if you take like a repressive state, like Iran, for example, right now, which is brutalizing its own population, right? If they had their druthers, there would be certain things that you see and certain things that you don't see. So if you show just one reality, and you don't show the other reality, that's not necessarily providing misinformation directly, but you're kind of obscuring something from view and therefore shaping what people are allowed to see. So I would say that that's a form of propaganda. I could
Definitely.
go, so there's, of course, yeah. So propaganda to me includes the deliberate propagation of misinformation. I think that's happening all the time, but it could also be more subtle. It could just be controlling information, getting selective messages out there, making sure people aren't seeing other points of view, right? Which isn't necessarily misinformation, but it contributes to kind of a blinkered or selective or partial view of reality. And that is also propaganda.
Of course. And you mentioned this idea of controlling, and it seems like a lot of the time the people in power are very much so controlling what we see. And countries like Qatar, for example, have invested heavily in media networks and international outreach to shape how these conflicts are portrayed. And how should we understand these state led efforts like Qatar's to promote particular narratives about conflicts like Israel and Gaza or the situation in Iran? And what impact does that have on the global perception?
Yeah, it's a great question. States like Qatar and other Gulf states that are kind of upstart, right? So remember that the Gulf states weren't really regional power brokers until the 1970s at the earliest. That's when they gained their wealth and didn't really start to flex their muscles until more recently in the last 20 or 30 years. It's very important for them to put out the perception that they're major players and power brokers in the region, especially since they're kind of taking that mantle from some of the other Arab states that used to be the center of gravity politically in the region, like Egypt or Syria or Jordan. So yeah, Qatar through their media, Saudi Arabia through their media, right? So Saudi Arabia controls Al Arabiya, Qatar with Al Jazeera, right? They are very invested in putting out the appearance that they are leaders, right? That they care about the region. And in the case of Al Jazeera, it's very important that they put out a message, not that they're just propaganda agents who put out a skewed or Arab nationalist or Qatari nationalist view of news and world events, but actually they care very much that it's seen as an objective, respected media organization, right? And so, for example, when they invested in Al Jazeera America, they're really trying to grow their brand as a very respectable, globally important media organization that can compete and be seen in the same light as like the BBC or the New York Times. Again, a lot of people associate Al Jazeera with propaganda, but that's not the intent. The intent is to make it seem as legitimate and professional as any other media organ in the world, just willing to cover things that maybe other countries' media are not. Um,
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit sort of what goes into gaining the trust of and the legitimacy of one of these major media networks like BBC or CNN?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the inner workings of journalism, but I think the question is what goes into building legitimacy around the media's brands?
Yeah.
Well, let me start with, an example closer to home. I think so what gives the New York Times legitimacy? And I think it's an age-old brand. It's been around for a really long time. It's seen to have world-class reporting, excellent writing, rigorous editing standards, and at least historically, I think people would have said that it is trying as hard as any other newspaper in the country to be neutral and objective. Now, increasingly, and I think this is what your audience might be interested in, I think this is where you might be coming from. We now live in a world where even the New York Times, which to me is still a very reputable media organization, is getting attacked all the time um, from both the left and the right with accusations of bias, right? So, I know you're interested in Israel and Gaza. So, for example, pro-Palestine activists on my campus refuse to engage with the New York Times, right? They call it the New York war crimes, and they accuse it of excessive bias in the favor of being pro-Israel or being complicit in a kind of pro-Israel lobby kind of take on things. However, there are also plenty of people in Israel and plenty of American Zionists who believe that the New York Times is biased in the other way, right? That it's actually too pro-Palestinian, it gives too much coverage to atrocities in Gaza, that it covered the war in a way that delegitimized Israel's right to self-defense. So it's really interesting that we just seem to live in times where even the claim to be objective is being called into question all the time. Now, back to, Al Jazeera, well, I think what brought them legitimacy was the fact that they invested a lot of money in sending correspondents to parts of the Middle East and covering events that were just not being covered anywhere else. And I think that they were really careful to be upholding rigorous journalistic standards. And again, it didn't win over everyone, of course, but I think a lot of people in academia on the left started to think that, hey, Al Jazeera, they're willing to show things that no one else is willing to show, and that kind of raises their standards in our view. I think that was kind of at least 10, 20 years ago, um, Al Jazeera was really impressing a lot of people.
Definitely. It also feels hard to talk about the sort of spread of ideas and this news culture without talking about social media because it's shaken up the entire way that people engage with information and who they trust. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how you think social media has sort of altered the formation of public opinion during these Middle Eastern conflicts, particularly in terms of trust and the persistence of misinformation and sort of what are the consequences of having such a social media dominant culture.
Mhm. Yeah, it's an awesome question, and it's something that I care very deeply about. I'll just start with a personal anecdote, which is that I swore off all social media about 5, 6 years ago. I thought it was really toxic and it made my quality of life much worse. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that everyone seemed to have a take. And it felt like people wanted to kind of perform their political take on social media really, really quickly and in ways that I didn't find particularly helpful. In some ways, it produced fights and conflict, and I just felt a lot of people were pouring energy that could be best spent elsewhere, right, into having these kind of virtual fights that were meaningless in the social media milieu. Now, my answer probably isn't going to surprise you. I imagine other scholars you're talking to will say similar things. I think social media is particularly damaging because of the echo chamber effect. Obviously, algorithms feed us things based on what it thinks is going to draw our attention, right? We live in a very convoluted attention economy where, you know, social media sites like Facebook get more money the more they can glue us to the screen and draw us in more and more and seize more and more of our attention. And so what seems to be galvanizing attention nowadays is outrage, right? So either outraged, we're going to see something that's going to elicit and evoke a really strong response, or a kind of solidarity that I think is actually kind of thin and flimsy, but this kind of like you get to pile on something that you don't like through social media, right? So it's either like it's showing us things that are going to provoke outrage, or it's going to make us feel like we have some kind of connection to a group of people who share our politics, although it doesn't necessarily facilitate any action except, cheerleading. So back to your interest about misinformation. Well, again, social media, it can be a wonderful tool, right? There are a lot of examples from the Middle East, especially from the Arab revolutions of 2011, where social media played an extremely important role in helping protesters plan events and organize, right? And it was very, very useful in Egypt, for example, which is the country I know best in the region. That's what my scholarship has focused on mostly to date. So like the Arab Spring in Egypt would not have happened. Mubarak wouldn't have been toppled without the role of social media. At the same time, especially as algorithms are getting more sophisticated, social media kind of fragments its audience, it divides us, and it feeds us things that we want to know or things that we already think we know. It's very good at kind of sorting us into groups. And so, like I was saying before in one of my earlier answers, it kind of gives us a distorted or partial view of reality, but never the complete whole. And then, moreover, because it kind of passes as real knowledge, I think it sometimes prevents us from wanting to dig deeper, have rigorous, more robust debate and discussion. And again, it encourages takes as kind of what passes as knowledge about the world. And so, yeah, I think it has a very pervasive and pernicious propaganda effect insofar as it's giving us these snapshots or these partial views of reality, right, through people's attempts to communicate or persuade that don't do justice to the complexity of the issues that they purport to be about.
Yeah. You mentioned the idea of separating us into groups and sort of isolating us with people who only share our same ideas. And I want to zoom out a little bit before social media and go to religion. And it seems like often there's claims to represent the true religion or the correct faith. And I wanted to ask you about how these religious narratives and tensions sort of intersect with propaganda and political legitimacy in modern Middle East conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that's another really deep question. So yeah, I think that inherent in all of the major world religions is the idea that there is a fundamental truth and that the religious faith that you happen to subscribe to has the ultimate take on that truth. Now, Islam, which is the majority religion in the Middle East, has built into it the idea that there were divine truths that had been revealed, both in Judaism and in Christianity. But the idea is that the prophecies that were revealed to Muhammad in the 600s sort of supersede the earlier prophets and the earlier revelations. So it's not necessarily that they're antagonistic. It's just, Islam managed to build into it a conception of sort of staged revelation, but then yes, Muhammad's revelations were the ultimate, or God's revelations to Muhammad were the ultimate revelations. Now, starting with the kind of academic study of religion and the discourse of democratic pluralism in the 19th and 20th century, right? The idea is that, and I think this is in tension with a lot of political movements that you're interested in. But the idea is that even though religions have different truth claims, they're all after similar things. They're all interested in ethics. They're all interested in morality. They're all interested in how to organize human society. And I think that sort of pluralist philosophers of religion and academics who study religion, like my colleague Joel Swanson at Sarah Lawrence, who would be someone you might want to talk to. He's really good. Would tell you that the idea is that there's more in common with religions than they often like to say about themselves. So religions can be like nation states where they all assume that they're completely unique, and yet the structures and the forms and the discourses and the narratives that they use are all extremely similar. At least in the Abrahamic faiths, I believe that to be true. So propaganda in religion, well, religion is no different than any other group, like or when it comes to political, so when it comes to politicizing religion, then it's not that different, right? Religious groups use the same media, use the same propaganda techniques as any other political movement or group that's trying to persuade or galvanize. And that could be political, that could be political Islam groups, that could be the that could be right in Myanmar, right? Like fundamentalist Buddhists. That can be religious settlers in the West Bank, Jewish settlers, right? So, there all of these groups might have very fundamentalist beliefs about their faith as the ultimate faith, and that might even turn into a violent ideology about the need to eradicate other peoples. But when it comes to propaganda, I don't think that religious groups relate to media or use propaganda in ways that are at all dissimilar from other groups that are just seeking to present a certain kind of narrative, right? Or and again, like I said, represent reality in a certain way, legitimize themselves in a certain way, communicate their principles, delegitimize their enemies or opponents, right? So, religious groups, yeah, I mean, religion is a unique phenomenon in the world, and yet when it comes to the way that religious movements use media, I think that they use media in very similar ways to other political movements or groups.
Yeah, this idea of morality is often one of the driving factors of why someone would choose one side or the other, or what these sides try to use to like bring new people to their side. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how these governments frame themselves as legitimate and their opponents as illegitimate morally and in any other way.
Well, it's a huge question. But I think your starting point is really significant, right? Which is that all states need to assert their legitimacy, right? That, any political theorist, and I believe you talked to a really good one, would tell you that all states, right? Even old states, revolutionary states, new states need to bolster their legitimacy, both internationally, right? So that they're recognized as a state among states in a world of in a world of not sovereign nation states, but perhaps more importantly to what you're getting at, they need to legitimate themselves to their own people. How is it that they have the power to govern? What gives them the right to make decisions at such a high scale? What gives them what Max Weber would call the legitimate monopoly the monopoly over legitimate use of violence, that was his definition of the state. And so states have always been very invested in using propaganda to bolster their own legitimacy. And again, here's where I want to just reiterate that I don't think propaganda is necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be on a base level a value neutral tool that groups use or states use in a variety of ways for good and ill. Right. So to take an extreme example, I mean, Nazi Germany was extremely skilled at using propaganda towards what I believe to be evil ends, but built its legitimacy off of a certain kind of propaganda that showed the country to be unified again, right after a period of disunity, right, and showed strength, and so strength and unity were some of the most significant effects of that propaganda. You know, the states use propaganda to bolster legitimacy when they, broadcast national rituals, July 4th events, things like that, right? In a way, it might feel completely different than Nazi Germany, but it's still about legitimacy, right? There are certain media events, right? So there's some theorists who studied television in the 70s and 80s who talked about these national media events, whether it's the funeral of a president or the moon landing or something like that, right? That well, the moon, that give legitimacy to the idea of the nation or the state, right? And so states are always looking to use whatever media or whatever means are at their disposal to naturalize the idea of national life. There's nothing natural about a nation state. Nation states are just political constructs, and borders change, and the people who constitute them change. But states like to give the effect that they're just in the natural order of things. Um, I can't think of a single state in the world that doesn't use propaganda in some way, that doesn't use the media in some way to bolster the legitimacy of the nation state project. Um, and sorry, I forget the last point I was going to make.
No worries. You talked about how it ranges from things like the Nazi regime all the way to more modern things like broadcasts of different events like the Fourth of July parades and things like that. I wanted to ask now more over time what continuities you see between historical propaganda and the way not only conflicts but other positive events are framed today.
Yeah, I love that question because when I teach my class on propaganda at Sarah Lawrence, this is something I really emphasize. I believe that there are really important and significant continuities in terms of how propaganda has been used and experienced. And the media might change, right? So you might move from, for example, print pamphlets or popular magazines to radio broadcasts and newsreel footage to television to internet and social media. And I do think internet and social media have different dynamics at play, like we were talking about earlier, the fragmenting effect, where some of these earlier broadcast media had a kind of unifying effect in terms of what people were seeing and noticing. But here are some of the continuities. I think that early on, so also let me just start by saying that I think that World War I was a major turning point in the history of propaganda. That was the period when all of the combatant powers, major Western powers, started to sponsor mass-produced propaganda. They created propaganda ministries and started to disseminate messages about the war on a mass scale to kind of shore up the home fronts and galvanize morale. It was really the first time that the morale of the entire nation was seen to be something that needed to be controlled and indeed manipulated. So after World War I think some of the tools that were just kind of forged kind of in real time as the war unfolded and according to the needs of the war have remained constant. One is the use of very resonant symbols, right? That you have to kind of find symbols that are like common denominators, symbols that somehow strike a chord with the population. And you need to do something bold with those symbols, whether that's inverting them or adding them together or mixing them in some way, right? Another thing is to appeal to emotion, right? I think that propagandists from very early on realized that people are more swayed by emotion than reason, right? And that there is a way to get to core emotions of people that would be more effective than making a kind of reasoned argument. And so if I'm using World War I as an example, some of these you can probably find these images easily online on a Google image search, and some of them are hard to see, but there was a lot of fear mongering. There was a lot of images produced by the American propaganda organization known as the Committee on Public Information. That was America's propaganda agency from 1917 to 1918. Images that they were behind that showed the kind of evil German Hun coming into the American home. And they were going to terrorize our women and children. But the idea of the sullying of the home, it played on fear, right? But another thing that I think is often overlooked in propaganda is that the most effective propaganda is able to build on a kernel of truth, right? So if propaganda makes totally outlandish claims, it's not going to work. But if there's something out in the world, that it can point to, some kernel of truth that it can hang on to, if it can build on already sentiment that already exists somehow and then mold it, it's going to be a lot more effective, right? So if there's already I don't know, I'm just trying to think of a good example. So let's take Nazi Germany, not the most pernicious aspects of the propaganda, but the parts that were actually about kind of unity and strength, right? So earlier on, before Hitler even seized power in 1933, when he was kind of giving stump speeches and the like, trying to build support for the Nazi party, the message that he gave over and over again was that Germany was weak because it was fragmented, right, into 30, 30 different political parties, and you can't have a strong Germany like that. Well, and he said that over and over again, and they had interesting images, and he had good rhetorical flourishes, but that was his message, and it works because there was a kernel of truth to that. Maybe his interpretation of Germany's weakness wasn't true, but people understood that there were 30 parties or many parties, that Weimar Germany was kind of dysfunctional and that democratic politics wasn't working particularly well. And so he can kind of mold that pre-existing sentiment, this understanding that people have, and then use that, mold it, and manipulate that to serve his own particular interests, which is that the Nazi Party is going to deliver strength and unity and transcend this division that's making us weak. So like that's an example of, this feeling was kind of already out there. People were already aware that there was this phenomenon in German politics, and he was able to use that. And the propaganda, I would argue, is more effective because it's building on kernel of truth, if that makes any sense.
Definitely. Your idea about how World War One was presented is also a really interesting one. And I wanted to talk about now one of what's at least one of the major conflicts in the world is almost always centered in the Middle East. And I want to ask you about how these political and why do these political leaders try to shape their conflicts, and why do they care so much about how they're understood internationally?
Okay. Are you talking about Israel and Palestine in particular, or Iran, or Iraq, the Iraq wars, or?
Well, I was referencing more generally, but I'd be very interested in your opinion on Israel and Gaza.
So I think, whatever your politics, and I really want to try to stay neutral as a kind of propaganda analyst. I think that both critics of Israel and strong proponents of Israel, right? So both Zionists and anti-Zionists might agree that Israel acts the way it does and puts out the messages the way it does because it is deeply concerned about its legitimacy, right? And Israel is aware that there have been attempts by the Palestinian national movement and critics of Israel from way back, right, to poke holes in the legitimacy of Israel as a sovereign nation state by pointing to 1948, right, the war of 1948, which Israelis call the War of Independence and Palestinians call al-Nakba, or the catastrophe, right? But that there's tremendous defensiveness within Israel about that event because they understand that to accept certain implications of what happens, like culpability for the Palestinian refugee crisis, the right of return, and all that follows from it, would be to call into question the legitimacy of the state, right? And so Israel is very, very, I would say, robust and very proactive in policing the discourse around the history of that particular event. And there's a great documentary that you and your viewers can watch called Tantora that came out a few years ago, which is about one Palestinian village called Tantora that was evacuated in the 1948 war, and is asking questions about why it was so difficult, why it has been so difficult for for the Israeli nation state to talk about those events. So it documents there was this one graduate thesis that was published, or that was accomplished by a man named Teddy Katz, and then he was attacked for libel based on what he had said, which was based on oral testimonies um, of the fighters who had actually been involved in that particular episode. So um, the sorry, I feel like I'm getting away from your original question a little bit.
No worries. This is very interesting.
So you know, and then Palestine, of course, bases its claims, its political aspirations on a certain kind of reading of history, right? So for them, 1948 is al-Nakba, and it is the catastrophe that led to the disintegration of Palestinian society. And to have that narrative acknowledged is fundamental to the political project of Palestinian nationhood and the ideal of a Palestinian state one day. And so what you really see within Israel, Palestine today is a kind of narrative war, right? Over whose narrative is acknowledged, right? And so Israel is very fierce about policing Nakba discourse within Israel. I think to the point of absurdity, right? So there was a movement once to teach the Palestinian national poet Mahmoud Darwish in Israeli school curricula that was voted down. Memorials and monuments to Nakba are scrutinized and shunted to the side, right? You're not really allowed to show that in any kind of this major Israeli population center that's not a Palestinian village, right? So yeah, Israel is very, very concerned about its legitimacy. Whereas Palestinians, especially in a period after 1948, when people were saying there's no such thing as a Palestinian, also believe that their narrative is fundamental for legitimacy. So again, we get back to this question of political legitimacy and how all the propaganda, and again, I don't mean that in a bad way. I think all states, all political groups do it. Um, the propaganda is about putting forward a certain kind of narrative that bolsters political legitimacy over time.
Yeah, to end on a little bit more of a grounded everyday kind of example, you come to this idea that everyone is using propaganda and they all want to emphasize their own political legitimacy. But and even when it's beneficial, it's still sort of nice to be able to parse through the information and just get to the facts. So what advice would you give to people trying to critically evaluate propaganda, specifically in the Middle East or in general?
Okay, yeah, it's a great question. First, I just want to say one thing as an aside, which is I don't believe propaganda is necessarily just in the political realm. The way that I was sort of trained and the way that I teach about it, there's also commercial propaganda, right? So I see advertising, Pepsi and Coke ads as propaganda as well, because they fit my definition, right? They're representations of reality that are trying to galvanize action or persuade, in that case, yes, to buy a product. But a lot of times it's bigger than that. It's to attach a certain kind of identity to a product, to build a brand around a product. And so they're very much steeped in the same kind of techniques about appealing to emotion, right, and appealing to our sense of self as earlier propaganda techniques. So I just want to put that out there. You could edit that out if you want. But um, I think practical advice. So again, you might and your viewers might disagree with me, but I just want to start by kind of reiterating and contending. Propaganda is everywhere. It's the kind of cheapest trick to assume that propaganda is what your political opponents do, whereas you are the ones who do the truth. If you study the Cold War, if you study the World Wars, World War I, World War II, you realize that these claims were going back and forth all the time. One side claims, this kind of actually is interesting in light of your religion question. One side always claims to have the kind of um, to dwell solely in the domain of truth. And then its political opponents are the ones who are doing the propaganda. And I would just urge us, first of all, to throw that idea in the garbage. Propaganda is all around us. It's a pervasive force that holds together the modern world. And so, I mean, the first thing that I would suggest, if you're interested, is make a propaganda log for yourself, a daily propaganda log. And by that I mean keep track of how many claims are being made to you through some kind of form of mass communication, right? How many times from the minute you wake up and pick up your phone to when you go to bed is someone trying to make a claim on you that's trying to persuade you of something, whether that's to buy Coke and not Pepsi, whether that's to click on this site, to pay attention to this comment, to celebrate this kind of patriotism over that kind of patriotism, to join this social movement, to join this club, right? How many times are people trying to make a claim at you that's not directed just at you, like not individual persuasion, but that's kind of a scattershot kind of communication out there. So like keep track of just how pervasive propaganda is in your daily life. Then the other thing I would say, if you want to focus more on political discord and the big political issues of our time, is get off of social media, right? Let social media guide you to what you're interested in. That's fine. But then really research the hell out of something, right? And read in media that you think you disagree with, right? Even if you think that a media organ is just like blatant propaganda in the bad sense, look at it, see how it, and then try to evaluate what are the claims it's making about the world. What does it base those claims on? How is it representing reality? What are the narratives that it's trying to uphold? And what are the narratives that are being obscured? Right? It's just, I mean, I guess I'm talking about just basic critical thinking, right? We all need to be very savvy readers of media, and we need to be independent critical thinkers. We need to be aware of our own biases when we approach a text. And again, we need to be aware of the fact that propaganda is pervasive and that we live in a world and we live in a time when we are bombarded with people trying to make claims and trying to tell us that their way of thinking about something or representing the world is the right one. I think the more we kind of understand that and can kind of see all of the work that's being done on us at all times, it can free us from it can free us from the trap of endless propaganda, right? So yeah, read things you disagree, read deeply. Don't stop at the hot take. Keep reading, keep researching, read people you disagree with, read media that you never thought you'd read, carefully evaluate the claims that are said, and weigh them against each other. And I think I know we don't always have time to do that on every issue under the sun, but the issues that you care about, I think it behooves us to give it a little more time and attention than we're often encouraged to do on social media.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Ellis.
Of course, it was a pleasure to